I love traveling, but border crossings always make me nervous. The glossy travel magazines barely hint at passports and visas, while I always seem to be confronted by an array of officials asking questions I'm not prepared to answer. Once in a tin-roof shack outside of Karonga, Malawi, the health inspector barely glanced at my yellow fever vaccination certificate before asking, "Are you married?" When I said no, he asked, "Why not?" Well, I stammered out something about not having met the right man, and he allowed me into the country. But the truth is that I'm okay with marriage, but I have a problem with weddings. The glossy bridal magazines show these elaborate gowns and perfectly matched bridesmaids. Weddings in my family don't work that way. My cousin Larry, he's a fan of Japanese animation and Star Trek. He and his bride had a lovely ceremony with an officiant wearing a kimono and Mr. Spock ears, who bade the happy couple to live long and prosper. His sister Susan was no good at arithmetic, but even she should have understood it was questionable to ask her 3.5-month pregnant future sister-in-law to be the matron of honor at a wedding to be held in 5 months. And then there's poor Aunt Sylvia. She would have saved herself many, many hours of therapy if she had only thought to ask Mark and Jana what it meant when it said on their invitation that the reception, to be held on a Northern California beach, was clothing optional. But at least my cousins were creative. All the weddings I went to growing up were exactly the same. They were held in the back room of Luigi Siegel's kosher restaurant. And before the ceremony, there were drinks in the form of a mildly alcoholic punch and hors d'oeuvres, which mostly meant a large swan carved out of chopped liver. The ceremony would have proceeded smoothly, except that Uncle Murray had ignored the punch in favor of his personal flask of Slivovitz, and called out each of the blessings just half a beat before the rabbi. But it was a nice enough wedding, and they always finished with the Viennese table of desserts being rolled in, and my cousin David, who would have become the Jewish Elvis if the payola scandals had broken a little bit later, singing Sunrise, Sunset. Well, there was another thing that was the same at all of those weddings. The groom was always my grandfather. My grandmother had died back in Europe, and Grandpa remarried for the first time shortly before coming to the US. That was not a successful marriage, and he was quick to take advantage of the liberalization of divorce laws in New York State. But he liked to go and dance at the Roseland Ballroom, and it wasn't long before he announced another wedding. 12 different women called our house asking, "Is it true Leo's getting married? I'm so disappointed." And one even sued him for breach of promise. His third wife made the strategic error of relocating them to Florida, and with a healthy supply of eligible widows, Grandpa was in his element, and it wasn't long before there was another divorce. And then one night I was sitting at the kitchen table doing my homework, and I heard my father talking to Grandpa in Yiddish, and suddenly Dad's vocabulary must have deserted him, because I heard him say in English, "Pa, you don't have to marry her. In America, they call it shacking up." But Grandpa went on to marry again and again. I lost count at 5. There was one wedding when I was growing up that was different. My aunt brought shame and disgrace on the family by marrying a man who wasn't Jewish. There was a lot of debate about whether or not we should go to the wedding, but finally there was a compromise. We could go as long as we agreed not to have any fun. Exuberant Italians ate lasagna and drank champagne while we sat in a corner eating frozen kosher TV dinners and drinking ginger ale. So with all this background, you can imagine how I felt when my brother announced he was getting married. Now that wedding went off without too many glitches, although Ramona did end up walking down the aisle to the salsa station on the radio. But before long, they were off to their honeymoon at Disneyland. Well, my tastes in travel are a little bit more exotic, and I was soon enough crossing the border from Nashki, Russia to Sukhbatar, Mongolia. One of the officials, I think it was the insurance inspector, asked me how come I was traveling with 3 men I was not related to. Wasn't I married? All I could do was smile and think, I'm sure marriage is a lovely country, but that border crossing is just a little too difficult.